Okay, good evening, everyone. It is now 5:30, and it's November 23rd, so we're going to open the Board of Election Commissioners meeting at 5:30 on November 23rd, 2021. First item of business is roll call. So Chairwoman Zaniku. Here. Vice Chairman Pope. Here. Commissioner Anthus. Here. Commissioner Patton. Here. Okay, all are present. Okay, next item is old business, vote to accept the meeting minutes from the prior meeting, and that is the October 12th, 2021 meeting. Okay, motion from Chairwoman Zaniku, seconded by Commissioner Anthus to accept the meeting minutes. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please indicate by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes. Okay, on to new business. Item A, communication regarding the official 2020, November 2nd, 2021 municipal election results. So attached is the official results, both the summary report and the statement of votes cast report. No real changes in anything. Overall turnout for a municipal election was good, 17.90%. In terms of municipal election, historically, that is good numbers compared to previous municipal elections. I think the closest we had to that kind of turnout was in the, I believe it was the 21, 29, I believe it was the 2017 election in which the Lowell High School was on the ballot. That one was higher, but for previous elections, this is good turnout. We've had some municipal elections where we had less than 10%, so which is good. It's not. Okay, so if there are no questions, I can move on. Okay, so moving on to item B, communication on observations of early voting and election day for November 2nd, 2021 municipal election, addressing voting numbers per location, early voting observations, logistics, DPW, LPD deployment, and sign setup. So just like in the preliminary election, I prepared a sort of preliminary report on observations and from the municipal election. So based on, first going to early in-person voting, based on the clerk's reports from early voting, both at the senior center and satellite locations, we were able to compile the following numbers of voters who took advantage of early in-person voting and sort of where they were distributed. General trends based on the numbers from the clerk's reports indicated that the senior center seemed to be the most used choice overall in terms of the average. There were a few satellite locations where voters did turn out, specifically Greenhalgh on the first day of early voting, so that's October 22nd. And there were also high numbers noted at J.G. Pine School October 24th. But that was only on the first day. Overall trends seem to indicate that the senior center for in-person early voting remains the most popular choice. Again, and that could be for a variety of reasons, availability of parking, familiarity with the senior center as a polling location in previous elections, and other reasons. Also, just wanted to note that this was the first municipal elections, both the preliminary and the municipal election November 2nd, that has ever held in-person early voting. And again, the reason for that is under state law, so Massachusetts state law, early in-person voting is only authorized for state and federal elections. But because of COVID this year, the state extended the early in-person voting regulations from last year to this year. So because of that, we were able to take advantage of that and offer in-person early voting for municipal elections. At this stage, it's uncertain whether the state legislature will expand in-person early voting as well as vote by mail without any reason for future local municipal elections. That remains to be seen, and that's up to the legislature and the governor for approval. But at least we have some data just to see how it went, and hopefully, based on this data here and data from other municipalities, maybe the legislature will look at that and see that's a positive development and, move forward with that. Something that hopefully, if the state does expand early in-person voting, something that they can look at is reimbursement. Typically for state and federal elections, any cost that we incur for early in-person voting is reimbursed by the Secretary of State's office and the state. So we receive money for any mailings we send out and any in-person early voting. Unfortunately, this year we had to cover all costs for in-person early voting. So hopefully, if the legislature looks to expand that in the future, they'll take a look at providing us with additional funding to help do that. In terms of election day logistics observations, day before the election, DPW workers transported the poll booths, equipment, supplies, and machines to the 11 polling locations. Other than expanding an extra route to take into account the additional polling locations compared between the preliminary and the municipal election, no major issues were noted. Equipment drop-off proceeded smoothly. And also, equipment drop-off was smoothly at the new location, Low Collegiate, which was used for the first time this year. DPW noted that just like at the schools, they were very cooperative and helpful in terms of setup at the gymnasium. Morning setup of the equipment, no major issues noted. Based on the experience in the preliminary elections, our office purchased additional extension cords and power strips, which were included in all poll worker supply kits. And that was done to ensure maximum flexibility in powering up all of the equipment, given that every setup is different. Poll workers indicated they had no problem, based on our review of the clerk's reports, with finding power, things like that. I think we only had one note. I guess with a few gymnasiums, their power cords are located above those pads that they have on the side of the walls, but that wasn't an issue. They were able to either do it themselves or get assistance. So again, setup was noted as uneventful. Poll workers, again, during the municipal election, expressed overwhelming support for the use of the new poll pads. They say that check-in was much quicker and easier compared to using the traditional check-in books, and they liked features such as the ID scanner. Another major feature that all the poll workers said that they really liked was the fact that the poll pad contained the entire voter list, not just, if you compare it to the books, only those voters that can vote at that polling location. So if a voter was at the wrong polling location, the poll pad would indicate they're in the wrong location, but also provide them what their correct location is. So they said poll workers and wardens and clerks noted in their reports that that's a really useful feature, and it helped cut down on the calls that we got at City Hall, which is good. So I think we noted that we did have less call volume in the phone bank and in the office compared to previous elections. Now, granted, it's a municipal election, so it's not that we can necessarily compare it to the phone bank that we received last year, but overall, it was good. So LPD deployment, again, similar to the preliminary election, LPD deployment was the same. They brought 2 officers, at least, were assigned to each polling location, although several locations did have 3. Again, it depended on assignment, and they were at the location at all times. Deployment of officers, as noted by the sergeant who was on duty and assigning, was uneventful. No major issues reported at polling locations from police officers. It was pretty smooth and orderly. Similarly, officer arrival back at City Hall with the ballots, the AccuVote machines, the poll pads, and the other equipment was also indicated as smooth. Finally, in terms of sign setup, so compared to the preliminary election, electronic billboards were set up at City Hall, the Senior Center, and some other high-traffic areas to advertise the municipal election and early voting. And these electronic billboards were supplemented by the A-frames that were also set up before the election. And compared to the preliminary elections, we also, the elections office had printed out brand new signs. They had the red borders on top of them. So it indicated the polling location, the district, the address, and to the extent that there was a split, which wards and precincts were split in the district. And we were able to provide 3 signs for each polling location, 2 that were in an A-frame that was placed at the entrance, and then 1 that could be placed at the polling location as the poll workers saw fit. A lot of them put it at the front door. And that's, I believe, what was done at Lowell High School, too. So at Lowell High School, there was an A-frame outside at the entrance, and then at the door, they also put the sign up. So that's sort of the report overall of the observations. Obviously, every election's an iterative process, and based on the clerk's reports and things like that, we know of areas in which we can improve. Again, this was the second election we've ever used poll pads. So obviously, in future training, we're going to improve that process in terms of how we train poll workers to use the poll pads. In particular, we're going to place some additional emphasis on processing, particularly EV and AV ballots. That was a new thing that poll workers were getting used to, and so we will work on that. But overall, based on observations and the clerk's reports, I think it was an overall a fairly successful election that was administered, I think, as well as it could be, given the circumstances.
So, yeah, you bring up a good point. Elliot, during my observation on Election Day, I know that the location that I had, the poll workers were not familiar with utilizing or using the poll pads all that well. Mm-hmm. And I did have to help train in a lot of them. So I know that leading up to the election, that was a major concern for this body, asking what was being done in terms of training. And I know you had indicated that you were holding training sessions as well as videotaping or recording training sessions. Mm-hmm. And sending them out. But I'm not sure how effective that was. And so I wanted for us to maybe think through and talk about different ways in which we can absolutely ensure that our poll workers are adequately trained prior to the election.
Sure.
That was an issue for me.
Yep, sure. And just to go over the training that we did conduct. So prior to the election, we scheduled 4 in-person training sessions, as well as, and those in-person training sessions covered not only the general election activities, but we also had a program where I emphasized use of the poll pad. So with all the people there, I would turn on the poll pad, so I'd go over how you set it up. I would turn on the poll pad in training mode, and I'd go over how to, all the functions of the poll pad. And afterwards, I would show them how to shut it off and dismantle it for storage. One area that we can definitely improve on is the training module covers everything in terms of processing voters and things like that. But there wasn't a section in the training module regarding processing EV/AV ballots. So the way it was done is they provided a handout. Obviously, for future training purposes, I'm going to try to prepare a new training module that goes over how to process EV/AV ballots. That was just, we followed the training program that it came with it. So I'm going to, in future elections, expand it so we can also cover processing absentee ballots, because I agree, that's something we can definitely look at. In addition to those 4 training sessions that we held, which included hands-on practice with the poll pad, for those that couldn't attend the in-person training, we also had a video program. And so just like in previous elections, the video program was divided into parts. And so part 1 was opening the polls, part 2 was during election day, and part 3 was closing the polls. I also added a 4th section, which was how to use the poll pads. So that was a brand new video that we did. And the video covered, again, similar topics to what we did in terms of the in-person training, which was how you set up your poll pad, how you use it during election day, and then how you turn it off, dismantle it to prepare it back to return to City Hall by the police. I think for future elections, something that I think we may look at, and I think it's something that I'm going to see if we can schedule out, is in addition to overall training as to how to do the election, one thing I'd like to do is do a training session which focuses exclusively on how to use the poll pad. Because what you can do is you can set up your poll pads in training mode and set them up, in sort of stations on the table and have poll workers go around to use it. I think something that also I think played a factor, which made it a little difficult, was COVID. We had poll workers who said that, they wanted to come in person, but because of COVID and concerns there, they, only watched the videos. And even though the videos, I think, were helpful overall, especially in previous elections, I think with a poll pad and a new piece of equipment, it always helps to actually have some hands-on experience.
So, not to interrupt, but I just wanted to ask, I know that because this body saw this as a potential area of opportunity before it happened, I know that we asked, and I specifically asked, if there could be an interactive virtual session, primarily basically on Zoom.
Mm-hmm.
And you told me that you would get back to me on that. I said, and I'd asked, the only reason why I'm asking this is because I know that some, people have different learning styles. So if you watch a video and you're unable to ask questions, you may not understand, everything or all the processes in that video. However, if you are in a true training, it should be an interactive where you're able to ask questions and then ensure that you're understanding the material.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that I didn't get an answer back from you in that, so I wanted to put it in the minutes or put it in, that should be part of going forward. Our training module should include, especially because we don't know when COVID's gonna end, right? If we're looking to a virtual world, we should also start thinking ahead and actually probably add a Zoom-like interface where you can train but then also have people interact and ask questions, so that they're not, for the first time, seeing the content or feeling or looking at it on election day.
Yeah, it's something we can definitely look for future elections. I tried to do
Yeah.
a Zoom session.
I know, you're just one person. I
Yeah,
know.
part of the problem was that
Yeah.
because it was a very truncated schedule from the preliminary to November, we only had a month, and as a
Yeah.
result, time was limited for things. But planning ahead, we can certainly look to make sure that we set up a Zoom session in the future, especially since
Or
we'll be.
Teams,
Yep.
that's just one, you know.
You know, it's definitely, because like you said, hands-on iterative process, you know, taking advantage of the new technology is always useful. And, you know, definitely, I think Zoom could be something that we can use for future training. My hope too is that, you know, as we use the poll pads more, again, this was our second election doing it, we now have greater experience doing it, and we can tailor the training better, because now we know more of the ins and outs of what these poll pads can do and how we can process it. Like, for instance, one of the things that I didn't know we could do with them was use the barcode scanner to scan in early voting ballots. And part of my concern about that was that the state directives regarding the use of ID scanner are extremely strict, because their concern is that because we're not an ID state, you can't have voters coming up and say, oh, hey, we can use the ID scanner. You know, it's like, oh, do we have to show ID? But because you're processing them on your own, you could use that ID scanner as a tool to help speed up the process. So, and that's something we'll certainly add to future training modules.
Right, so, yeah, because I was training with that, because they, remember the first batch, they had so many, and they were actually taking a longer time. I said, no, we can actually do this, because it's not an ID, it's actually already checked in. We already know that.
Yep.
The EVAV, you know, so, anyway, yeah, so that was all, that's my comment. Anyone else have any observations from Election Day?
I just had a question. About how many provisional ballots did we deal with?
Based on our review, there weren't many at each location, which I think was testament to the power of the poll pads, because it was able to direct voters to where they needed to go. And in fact, that was one comment one of the wardens said, that they said, what's great about the poll pads is that when you pull up a voter and they're in the wrong location, it says it right there on the poll pad what their correct location is. So they were able to actually direct a lot of voters to the correct location without having to call us. So
Do we have a number, approximate number?
I have all the clerk's
Ballpark?
report in the bottom. If I was to hazard a guess, I'd say probably less than 40, actually, when you take into account each location. It was about, I think, the only location that had more than 5 was, I believe it was Lowell High School. And 2 of those actually were voters that were supposed to go to Robinson, but they ended up doing it at Lowell, so we accepted those. Most of the provisional ballots that were reviewed were rejected because they weren't registered to vote, so.
Okay.
But yeah, it is, I think, another good example of the power of the poll pad, because compared to other elections where we've had much more in terms of our provisional ballots, there was a noticeable decline, which I think is great, because it shows how the poll pad can direct voters to where they need to go, which is good. And it has that direction printing function. Now, obviously, because we can't connect our poll pads to the internet, you can't give full driving directions, but you can actually print out a receipt that gives the address of where their correct polling location is, which is really helpful. In fact, I ran into a couple of voters. I think it was outside of District 8. I was walking in, and they said, "Oh, do you work for the city?" And I said, "Yes." They said, "Oh, I got to tell you, these poll pads are great because they were able to, print out the address." So.
Any other questions?
Okay. So moving on to the next item is, so response to inquiry regarding, from Commissioner Pope regarding the name of the Elections Office.
Correction, that's the Elections Commission.
Oh, Elections
Because
Commission.
the consent decree refers to the Election and Census Commission.
Yep.
And you said that was
Before-
our actual name.
Before we go to C, I'm sorry, I had one other observation.
Oh,
if I
for
may.
B?
Yes.
Sure.
So we were downstairs in the elections office, and there was a voter that came in and indicated that he was unable to vote in his district although the census data that he had, was sent to his home, as well as every other, city, bill he gets at his home. But his registration to vote was still, showing his mother's address 18 years prior. He indicated that he had been down, to change that address multiple times, but for whatever reason, it wasn't changed. And so my question is, understanding that, it's on the voter to ensure that they have the right, address, I guess, in the system for us, is there an audit process that we could utilize to ensure that the information in the poll pads are accurate to those on the census data that we currently have? Is there, and then secondly, part two of that question is, what do we do now for an audit process?
In terms of the voter list, there isn't a audit per se, and the reason for that is we have to accept voter applications as they come. So what we indicate in the annual census that the elections office conducts is that it's a reminder that the election census doesn't constitute voter registration. So it's, there's a statement on there that reminds them that even though you're responding to the local census, you have to double check to make sure that your voter registration is up to date. In terms of an audit, based on my review so far, there isn't an audit process of the election list. But what we do is that after a period of time, there is a removal of inactive voters from the list. So it sort of is it isn't really a one and done process. You have to wait a period of time for each voter first to become inactive, and then to ensure that they don't participate in a couple of elections prior to you being able to put them on a final delete list. And then you have to give those voters a final notice that, and that's mailed out saying that, hey, you haven't voted in several elections, you're an inactive voter, you're going to be removed from the list. So generally that process occurs every couple of years, and it depends again on voters missing, one being inactive and two, missing 2 federal elections. So only when that occurs can you start removing it. And it's a long process, and it's designed purposefully by the state because it's very important that we don't delete voters, inadvertently.
Sure. So I understand the purge process, but my question's a little different. I'm asking, and if we don't know the answer, that's fine, we can go and research it, right? If there is an audit process, and if there is not one currently for our elections office, right? Can we create one, or are there best practices in other cities and towns that may or may not have this? Because what was, aside from the fact that this specific voter couldn't vote in his district, and so now we're moving to district elections, right? It's not like before we're be able to vote anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And he wanted to vote specifically for his candidates in his district. And so since his mother lived in a different district, he did not want to participate in the voting process because of that, because he'd been following the candidates in his district, is what he indicated, what he told us. So so for our elections now, especially thinking about the consent decree and being really mindful of the way that our process is working now, I think it's very important and imperative that we should think about ways to audit our voters list so that it gives the greatest amount of people that want to vote the chance to vote. You remember? Do you remember the person that I'm speaking of?
Yes, I believe I do.
Yes.
And,
Yes. And,
Yeah.
And he was really articulate, and he indicated that he'd been down there a few times, had this change, and every other piece of mail that he gets from the city goes to his home, his current home, which he is a homeowner. But then just the voter, his voter information still showed 18 years prior to his mother's address.
I have to say, I'm a little skeptical because when I went and renewed my driver's license, they sent my address to the election office and then sent me a notice saying I'd been registered to vote. So if he's had his driver's license renewed with his new address at any time those 18 years, should have gone right to the address, right to
So-
there.
He said that too, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and again, I can't speak for the DMV.
Yeah.
I know
He
we've
did say
had,
that, yeah.
in fact, we have had several problems with the DMV, getting voter registration, at issue. But I can certainly reach out to other communities regarding best practices and see what options are available. But, we're pretty constrained regarding what we can and can't do with the voters list. But no, we'll certainly look into it.
Okay. Thank you, that's all. We can proceed now.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay, so on to item C. So I did some research, and under Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 51, Section 4, making of lists by registrars or boards, the authority to conduct annual censuses is under the Election Commission or a board of registrars if the community has that. So, based on state law, the conducting of a annual census is done by the Election Commission.
Which we haven't done since I've been on it.
Well,
We've had a census, but we haven't had anything to do with it.
right, but our office conducts it.
Well, wait a minute, you just said the commission conducts it.
Well, right, but the elections office conducts it administratively.
Yeah, I understand that, but the consent decree referred to the Elections and Census Commission, but I haven't found any place that says Elections and Census Commission. My letter of appointment was to the Elections Commission,
Mhm.
not to the Election and Census Commission. If I look on the city webpage, it does not refer to Election and Census Commission, it refers to the Election Commission. But we are the Election and Census Commission, so we should have something to do with the census. We're not gonna go out and take the census, but we ought to at least look at what we do with it. We haven't anything to do with it, so we don't know what's involved in it other than a questionnaire.
Well,
That's my point. If we're tasked by state law with being the Census Commission, we ought to be the Census Commission.
well, right, but the office has been conducting the census every year,
Office
though,
has.
Jim.
The
Right.
office has. I'm talking about the commission, of which we are the commissioners. And if we're tasked with making sure that's done right, we ought to at least have something to do with it. We're not tasked with running the elections, for example, where we're tasked with making sure it's managed and done in a fair and equitable manner. And so we get involved in it. And I was just kind of surprised to see that, since they were suing the commission, that it was the Election and Census Commission, and if now you say we actually are the Election and Census Commission. What I was looking for is some kind of reference, and I think you pointed that out, whatever that
Right,
was, so we are the Election and Census Commission.
right, well, yes,
Okay.
we are the election commission, and just like with communities all over the Commonwealth, one of our responsibilities is dealing with the local census.
Okay,
So,
which we haven't done to this point. Commission has not. You have, but the commission has not. I dare say if you go through our minutes for the last 2 years or 3 years or whatever, you won't find anything at this meeting where we talked about the census.
okay, but, forgive me, Jim, I'm not really following because, I don't know necessarily what we would discuss. You prepare, it's a pretty standard, straightforward procedure that's followed by all municipalities. You prepare a mailing, and the mailing's pretty standard, per communities. And then you send the mailing out to voters.
So do we determine what the actual questionnaire is, or is it?
No,
the state?
It's based on state directives. So the state directs what has to be on the questionnaire, and we design the questionnaire.
Okay,
Well, actually, the printers designed the questionnaire to meet those standards, and we've been using the same standard for, decades, I think.
okay. But, just
And then-
just as we review the results of elections, we never review the results of the census.
Yeah, it's just, there isn't really a result to the annual, you send them out, you get responses, and then whatever response you get, you process through them, and those annual censuses that don't have a change, you just, file them, and those that have indicated a change, the workers in the elections office go through entry by entry and update them. That's pretty much it. And, in the forms, you've got this barcode on them, so, because again, the labels are sort of generated from the state lists. So what we do, like many other communities do, like many cities, when they print them out, they have a barcode on them. So to the extent that a annual census form has a change, you can scan it in to make it easier to find that person in the annual census, and then you just update the information as you go. So it's a pretty,
So when is the next census?
It's conducted every winter, so around January, February, so.
Okay.
um,
So the results are available to us?
Yeah, you just, I don't know even how you would classify a result, because essentially the information goes into the voter lists. So, if you don't respond to your local census after several times, you become inactive. So your voter entry in the list indicates you become inactive instead of active. So, and then, you just go from there. So, it's not like you produce a,
The census determines whether you're active or inactive. I thought you were saying whether or not you voted determined if you're active or inactive.
well, it's that too. There are several things that can make you inactive. The most common one being that you don't respond to the local census every year. Another one is if you don't participate in several elections. If you don't participate in several elections, it's eventually noted in the database, and then your status goes from active, an active voter, to inactive. So it's similar to if you don't participate in your local census after several years. You go from active to inactive, and it's sort of an automated process within the state database. So yeah, to the extent that there is a annual census result, you see it in the voter lists, because that's how you determine whether someone goes active or inactive.
And once we have someone that goes, just this, a hypothetical, goes quote unquote inactive because they did not fill out the annual census, do we, at that point, send out notification to that family or that person stating that they're now an inactive voter due to?
No, the state database doesn't generate an inactive notice.
So is there any way we can just write that down too? We're forward thinking right now. I'm just putting it out there.
One result from the census is, of course, is just a list, just like the voter list. You
Yeah.
get a voter list of people's names and addresses and how they're registered and how they voted. And you get the same thing with the census. And for one thing, you can see where people claim they live.
Exactly.
Right.
So not what they tell us where they live, but where they claim they live on the census.
Right, and the goal of that is, to the extent there's a change, you update it in your local census. But, again, that information is different from voter registration. And that's why it's a very strict process, because when you submit a voter application or a voter registration card, even if you're updating it, you're swearing on the pains of penalties and perjury that this is who you say you are, this is where you register to vote, and things like that. So, again, as we indicate in the notice, just because you respond to your local census doesn't mean that you're registering to vote. You have to actively do that, either through the state's website or by coming into the office and submitting a paper application. Or, we can mail one to you and you mail it back. And that's important too, because, every time we receive a voter application, once we input the updates and things like that, it's time-stamped and then we file it away. So you have a record of that update. Same thing online. If you do it online, there is a record online so that every change is recorded, in the log.
So the
So,
previous censuses are available now. Others, theoretically, we get a disc with the census, results of the census on it, is that correct?
well, you put in a request for a voter list, and
Well,
we
I'm not looking
generate.
for a voter list, I'm looking for how people responded to the census. I have a voter list, you've already gave me one of those.
I mean, you can generate the forms again for all the for all the voters.
Well, we're not looking for voters, we're looking for respondents to the census, which give their name and their address and whatever data's on there. How they're registered, you know, et cetera. So it should be the same, just like a voter list, only it's a different database.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be a street list or list. I mean, I could certainly look in the extracts if it's a public information extract, because some of them aren't. You know, you can't just simply produce, I think law enforcement is one category that you can't produce a list of that, even if it responds to
I
the
think the Election and
census.
Census Commission could have a list of the census.
Right. I can certainly look,
Okay.
at that. Sure.
Okay. Good enough.
Okay. Anything else on C? Okay. Moving on to D, this is response to inquiry from Commissioner Pope regarding applicability of special acts. Unfortunately, with the election, and we're also certifying signatures for the state ballot questions next year, I unfortunately haven't had time
Okay.
to look at that,
I
but,
just wanted to bubble it back
Yeah.
up so it's on our radar.
but again, I can certainly look at that. Unfortunately, at this point, we're certifying signatures for the state ballot questions, so we have to get those done and sent to the people who have submitted those signatures by November 29th, which isn't ideal because we have Thanksgiving this week, so we've sort of been
It's Monday, right?
on a run. Yeah, next Monday, so. Okay, hearing nothing else, I'll move on to item E, which is just a communication regarding the re-precincting. And so included in your packets is the re-precincting information that was approved by the city council. And again, just to go over the re-precincting process, when the federal census is conducted every 10 years, the Massachusetts Secretary of State's office provides each municipality with that census data, because based on population changes, wards and precincts have to be adjusted to account for population changes. So, again, because of issues and delays with the federal census in 2020, we didn't get our census data until late September, early October. So typically, you get your federal census data early in the year, February, March. So you can do so communities can do their re-precincting process prior to upcoming elections. But again, we had to make do with, when we received it. So again, just to go over the local process, the Secretary of State's office provides each community with the census data. And in addition to the census data, they also provide the sort of, as you can see in the packet, the population changes. And they also provide the re-precincting maps. And this year, the Secretary of State's office prepared our re-precincting map to take into account both our population changes as well as the federal consent decree, to make sure that our wards and precincts would now fit within the new district-based system compared to what we were operating on in the previous, we were operating on the previous system because we didn't get the federal census data in time.
Did our expert make any changes to what the Secretary of State sent originally?
No. In fact, our expert noted that changes could not be made because state and federal law requires that a certain number of people can be within a precinct. And you're not allowed a deviation above or below a certain percentage. And the Secretary of State, when they prepared the map, took that into account when preparing these wards and precincts. And when it was reviewed by our expert, as well as other people, reviewing the population, they said, these precincts are such that you are within those, deviations. And they said that any maneuvering within the boundaries would throw off other precincts, because it's essentially, if you, to maybe use a tortured metaphor, it's a bit like a Jenga thing, where everything has to be aligned a certain way. And if you make adjustments to one, you throw off adjustments to other. So, so the Secretary of State's office prepared the map. They also prepared the legal metes and bounds, which was then provided to the city for review to make sure that the metes and bounds were correct. And then, we had to submit, prior to final approval, those legal descriptions, which the Secretary of State's office then reviewed and, again, provided corrections back. Once the Secretary of State's office provided the map and the metes and bounds, then under state law, we have to provide it to the legislative body for your community for approval on the local level. So for towns, that's your, selectmen. For cities, it's your city council. So the city council, in the October 26th meeting, reviewed the re-precincting map prepared by the Secretary of State's office, as well as the final metes and bounds, and voted to approve it. That was in keeping with a very strict timeline that the Secretary of State's office set for local communities. They said that all local communities, towns and cities, had to approve their re-precincting maps before October 30th. And that failure to do so would result in potential fines and penalties, including which the Secretary of State's office could appoint a master who would essentially create our maps and charge us for it. So once the city council approved the re-precincting map and the metes and bounds, it's then sent to LEDRC. And I had it in front of me what that meant, but it's a local, it's not a local, it's a state commission that's set up by it's affiliated with the Secretary of State's office, but its members are appointed by the governor. And it's designed as a nonpartisan electoral body that reviews each re-precincting map from every community and then votes to approve it. Once they approve it, it's then sent to the state legislature for final review and approval, after which that becomes the final map for your community. It's my understanding from a representative from LEDRC that they reviewed Lowell's map in addition to, I think it was 30 other communities. They do it in batches, so they have a meeting every week or so, and they review each map in turn for each community. It's my understanding that the map was approved and it has now been sent to the legislature for final review. Again, until the state legislature approves it, though, nothing is final. But at least we followed the state and local process as directed by the Secretary of State's office.
So as we discussed before the meeting started, the Election Commission has nothing to do with setting up the structure of the elections.
No. Per the SEC directive, it's done through, they prepare the maps and things like that. It's sent to the local community, and then it's the highest legislative body that approves it.
But who reviews it before it goes to them?
It's reviewed by local officials.
Who are the local officials?
For us, it was myself and the GIS director. And the reason we use the GIS director is because they have the maps. So we could compare the map that the Secretary of State's office prepared for us with the map that we have, the maps we have in the city. So we can go over the metes and bounds to make sure that they line up. And obviously, Professor Priscilli as well, who
That's what I was going to say,
Who-
and the professor too.
yes,
Yeah.
he reviewed it to make sure that it was in keeping with the requirements under the federal consent decree, which it was.
It would be helpful to see the map for 2010 side by side with the 2020. I don't know if you have that available.
I don't think we have that available, but I can certainly look to see if we can do it. So, like, sort of a superimposed kind of thing?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I'll see if we can do that.
And the other question was to do with wards. Are wards part of this approval process?
Yes, they are.
I'd like minutes to show that I don't understand this at all, because wards do not enter into the election results. Wards are an artifact that are set up to allow the parties to organize. It's the precincts that are the building blocks for election.
Yes,
And we use the precincts to make districts. We can use them to make wards, but nobody gets elected in a ward except a party official.
my understanding, though, from the Secretary of State's office on the local process is, while the precinct is the quote-unquote the building block, it's the ultimate unit.
That's right.
You do form it up into wards, though, that reflect other boundaries and delineations. So for instance, if you look at,
If that's true, this is insane to have the fourth ward have that piece across the river as well as downtown. Because party trying to organize that and organize those pieces. I can see if we want to do that for municipal election, because we have 8 districts. But we've gone from 11 wards down to 8 wards. And, I mean, it's not just me complaining. I've heard the Democrats complaining too about how it's going to be crazy to try to organize it the way they've set these wards up. And I see no reason why the state is telling us how we should set our wards up, because it doesn't affect the elections. I mean, you say, oh, your Ward 2's precinct 1, but that Ward 2 doesn't mean anything. Might tell you where you are, but nobody runs in a ward. And you do not report election results based on wards, based on precincts and districts, whether it's a district for the council, or whether it's a district for the state legislature, or whatever. The wards don't enter into that. And yet here they are telling us what our wards have to be. I just like the record to show that I think it's insane.
okay.
Since we're not gonna be able to do anything about it, I guess that's it.
Yep, we can put that in the minutes.
Not that anybody reads the minutes except us.
Like I said, unfortunately, it's, stayed in,
I
Stay
have no
long.
illusions, about
No.
that.
okay, anything else on E? Okay, I guess, hearing none,
Move we adjourn.
okay. Motion from Commissioner Pope to adjourn, do we have a second?
Second.
Second from Chairwoman Zaniku. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor indicate by saying aye.
All right.
Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing none, this meeting is adjourned at 6:23 PM. And to everyone watching, a happy Thanksgiving.
Happy
Yeah.
Thanksgiving.
Happy-
All those who are not watching.
Yep, happy Thanksgiving to the
Yeah.
commissioners as well. I hope it's a
too.
safe and
way-
healthy one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Remember,
Eat
motion
lots
to
of
adjourn,
turkey.
do not open to discussion.